Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Messy City podcast. Kevin Klinkenberg back here with you, and I have one of my good friends in the world of new urbanism here with me today. I'm very fortunate to have Dan Parolek with Opticos Design. Been excited to have Dan on here for a while and talk about things. Dan, how are you doing?
Kevin, thanks for having me. I'm doing great. Yeah, doing some really exciting things and look forward to diving into a conversation with you about all things urbanism
I, I,
related.
I kind of feel like we could almost do this like Joe Rogan style and go for 3 or 4 hours. I don't think that would be hard
Yes.
for us,
Yeah.
but we'll try to keep it down to about an hour, and we'll probably just have to do this again a couple of times. There's so much that we could talk about. Um,
Yeah, that sounds great.
so Dan, for those who don't know you very well, I mean, you have this fantastic firm in Berkeley, California, and you do work all over the country. People probably think that you're some sort of Bay Area elitist. Why don't you tell people the truth?
Yeah, that's really good. And it's interesting is because we do work all across the country, and I'm always often traveling to give presentations, missing middle housing. All corners of the country is like people realize how approachable I am. I have that Midwestern sensibility. I grew up in a small Midwestern town, population 20,000, Columbus, Nebraska. One of the many Columbuses in the Midwest, but the one that nobody knows about. But it's actually where I first experienced good urbanism. When I was growing up, the downtown was super vibrant, and there was Sears, J.C. Penney's, two hardware stores, lots of restaurants. The bike shop was there, which was most important for me and the neighborhood gang. That we'd get on our bikes and ride across town to downtown. And also, my great grandmother lived in a duplex a block and a half from Main Street. So, like that was my introduction to urbanism and placemaking, and didn't realize it at the time, obviously, but very foundational. And so, we work in big cities, but we also understand small towns as well. And so, actually, there's a good core of our work where we have purposefully decided to keep working in small towns because a lot of those places kind of need the work the most and don't have the planning staff. So, and Stefan Pellegrini, one of my two other business partners, is super passionate about small town work, and he's kind of worked up and down the Central Valley with what used to be the local government commission on state funded projects. But so um, it's interesting. I think people find us very approachable, right? Very unassuming. And a lot of times are kind of taken aback when they find out that we're based in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And I do want to say we did just last year opened a Chicago office.
Hmm.
I was super excited about that. Jennifer Settle, who worked with us a number of years ago and moved back to the Midwest for personal reasons, is running that shop. So it's exciting to sort of be branching out like that.
Yeah, it's great to have a footprint for you. I think in multiple locations.
Yep.
So what we met almost 25 years ago now, which is really shocking to think about. But and actually, the first thing we worked on together was in a small town. It was in Truckee, California,
Hmm.
a very unusual small town in many ways. But uh, I remember like right away we kind of connected, started talking about what later you developed into missing middle housing, and I think both of us had this fascination with building types and things that were out of the single family or large apartment building type. And I even remember spending a few times with you in Berkeley and going up and down all the different corridors and neighborhoods in Berkeley, and you really talking at length about the different missing middle types that you saw then. So it's interesting because I feel like that's become a big part of your work today, but it's something that you've actually been talking about for almost 3 decades now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so a couple of things is when I was in graduate school at UC Berkeley. So I have undergraduate architecture degree from Notre Dame, which obviously taught me all these foundations. Practiced for a number of years in New York City, and then decided I wanted to work at a neighborhood and city scale. So I found this amazing programming group of mentors at UC Berkeley to basically supplement my design background with like an understanding of how to get things implemented. And I just imagine I can remember doing studio pinups with Alan Jacobs of the Great Streets notoriety, and he'd be like, "Good design, but how is this going to get implemented?" I'm like, "Oh shit! Like I don't know. Sorry." Beep. Like but I also did a really interesting study there called the perception of density, and me and two of my classmates actually. This is kind of where in undergraduate. I was doing a studio with Michael Lykoudis, who was the dean for a long time, but he was just teaching studio when I was there in the early to mid 90s. And he took us out to Madison, Indiana, and he had us document building types, civic space types, street types. And it was the first time we had done that in a studio, and it was just eye-opening to me. I was like, this is where like the light bulb went off. Is like, this is what I want to be doing. And then in graduate school, I did this perception of density study where we took three different groups of people out to three different neighborhoods in the Bay Area that all had the same density on paper, but felt very different to us, to try to get to the essence of like, what is it about the built environment that's impacting people's perception of the density? And obviously typology is a part of that. And then for my thesis project, my graduate thesis project, I entered a design competition called Housing the Next 10 Million, which was how it was sponsored by the Great Valley Center in, it was like, how is the Central Valley of California going to grow and accommodate, the growth without impacting its agricultural economy and character? And I actually took Modesto, which is sort of outer Bay Area, a small town that very much similar to like the town I grew up in. And I did a comprehensive plan, but then I picked a sub area at the edge, and I did a plan for a new urbanist sort of T&D project. But then I also wrote a form-based code with typologies in it that had like the full range of missing middle typologies. And part of the inspiration was, I remember looking through Peter Katz's book, The New Urbanism, and just studying that and studying it over and over in all the different projects. And then there was a book called Towns and Town Making Principles. And Bill Lennertz wrote a chapter on building types, and I studied that. And so, our in our very first public, so I was fortunate, I was able to start my practice immediately after graduating. And that's when we met, and we worked on several projects together in Chico and Truckee. And so those had missing middle typologies, like you and me and, John Anderson and other groups of people that were brought in and out of those projects were thinking about this. And our first public sector project that is happening about that same time, sort of the late 90s, is we were hired to do a master plan for Isla Vista, which is the unincorporated community next to UC Santa Barbara. And it's a grid of about, I think, like 6 blocks by 8 blocks that's completely surrounded by open preserved wetlands on 3 sides, and the coast on the other side, the university on the 4th side. So but we did a revitalization strategy and wrote a form-based code with the missing middle typologies in it. And it actually had 3 types. It had a cottage court, a side court, and just a courtyard type. And I remember at the time, the Santa Barbara County planning staff thought we were completely nuts. They had no idea what we were. It was like we were speaking a different language. So Stefan had to take every lot size that existed in Isla Vista and do an axiometric drawing of how the type would adapt on the variety of different, so we had this catalog of okay, they're like, how can we possibly only allow three types. I'm like, well, it's not allowing three types. The types evolve based. So anyway, so yeah, so we've been doing this for a while. It's you were like on version like 24.0, I guess, at this point, right?
Yeah.
Not 1.0. So it's we're still super excited about it, and still passionate about it. So it's and we're excited to see it having a real impact
Mhm.
at a national and even really international scale now. It's missing middles really become a movement, which sort of above and beyond what we ever expected the impact to be.
Yeah, it's funny to think back and imagine that graduate work almost like laid out the next 2 or 3 decades of professional work that you are going to undertake.
Yeah.
Um, so I know that you've always used Berkeley and the neighborhood where you live and neighborhoods around it as sort of a source of inspiration, for a lot of just urban design and for missing middle housing. There's a lot of things that I'd like to touch on today, but I was curious. One of the things we corresponded with a little bit was talking about like what's going on in Berkeley today and how that's impacting the life in the city and uh, maybe the affordability of it, the attainability of it. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges. And I mean, there's obviously opportunities. It's a great community, but what are you seeing that's going on today in Berkeley?
Yeah, this is something I never expected to see in my lifetime. Where, right, for the last 20 plus years, there's been, I mean, we all were trying to get cities prepared for the demand for walkable urbanism. And 20 years ago, the cities were like, why would we spend time and energy doing that? And of course, they've been overwhelmed by the demand, right?
Mhm.
And I always tell people I'm not an economist, but high demand and low supply related to walkable urbanism equals very high housing prices. And so, what I'm seeing in places like Berkeley, and unfortunately, it's large parts of the country now that I would have never expected housing prices to be so high, even large parts of Florida, just really attractive places to live. Um, a couple of things we're seeing is like from a perspective of like trying to run and manage a small business, even for us who are offering sort of professional salaries, we're having a really hard time recruiting people from outside the Bay Area to work with us because the sticker shock of cost of living. And so part of the reason for us opening a Chicago office, right, is like we can now, if we're recruiting somebody, we can say, well, there's a couple of options. You can come live and work in Berkeley, or you can move to Chicago, which has a much better sort of cost of living, and delivers good urbanism as well. But the other aspect that I'm seeing and that I'm not seeing any discussion about is, we stayed in Berkeley because of the food culture, all the great local small businesses, the creative businesses. And over the course of the last 20 years, we've just been seeing that disappearing, right? Is because no small business can afford to lease a space and to take the risk of like the cost is too high to take a risk to start a business. And so all of that reason for wanting to be in a place, all those amenities are disappearing. And so I wonder at what point it sort of tips and it's like, wow, like, why would I be spending this much money to live in a Berkeley when I can move to Des Moines, Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's actually probably more of those amenities there now because somebody can afford to open a creative restaurant or a creative small business or a creative shop that sells the things they're making. And we saw this in Cincinnati when we worked there 10 years ago, right? Is like there's somebody in the back making shoes and they're selling them up front. It's like an old model, but good urban places foster that. And it's super interesting because like I just wonder at what point these super attractive places start losing people. I think they already are, but like when it tips that threshold, when like all of a sudden, like why would we want to be in a Berkeley, California, or like a Seattle,
Yeah.
when we can get just as good of urbanism, and maybe not, maybe even better um, vibrancy and local businesses in a different place. And like I said, I never expected to see that in my lifetime, that sort of impact. But I think it's really important for all of us to be thinking about in our practices and discussions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to a small degree, I think we're starting to see that in Kansas City in a couple of ways. One is obviously what's happened in our own urban core has been just wonderful over the last couple of
Yeah.
decades with
Yeah.
uh, transformation and the willingness of people to live in the city. So that's one aspect, but the other is we have seen some of that outflow from places like California, that some of the really expensive markets. And
Yeah.
I mean, my wife and I now we have multiple friends, like parents at our school and stuff like that, that within the last 3 or 4 years left California and came to Kansas City. And in large part, it was because of feeling priced out of those markets that they were in. I mean, we have a trickle compared to like the people who go to Colorado or Idaho or something like that, but
Sure.
it still happens. And I think there's a point in there that you make that's really important that I don't feel like in the new urbanism we've talked enough about, which is that relationship between the variety of building types that are possible in a community and how that makes affordability of all different kinds, attainable to so many people. So, and it's not just, the affordability of maybe buying a single family house, but renting a small apartment, it's owning a duplex or a triplex, but also when you have enough variety of commercial space, the ability to lease in relatively inexpensive commercial space.
Yep.
Um, it, it,
And I know you've done documented some thinking and done some work on that front. I think it's really important, and it's yeah, I don't think we talk about it enough, of like what's the role of the main street, the neighborhood main street. And it's always a challenge to make that happen. But I think there's a lot of creative thinking happening in that front. I was a couple of weeks ago, and I was in Atlanta, and the neighborhood that's adjacent to the former Braves Stadium, just
mhm,
south of downtown, um, was seeing a ton of, I think, one of the universities are now using the stadium, and it spurred all this private sector investment around it. And there was a existing, an older neighborhood main street that I would imagine 10 years ago was probably boarded up and mostly just vacant buildings. But as part of the development strategy, the developers hired a group to actually program that main street. And it was amazing. Like, I hung out there, I had lunch there, I met with some people there, and I'm like, wow, this is, they understood the value of investing in that main street as the amenity, right, for
mhm.
the rest of their hundreds of units of development, maybe even thousands that were in progress happening around it. But it's critical. And it yeah, it's going to be interesting to see kind of where that goes. It's like in the media you see all this conversation about, this polarized conversation about, oh, people are moving out of cities and moving to the suburbs, and that's not what I'm seeing. You're seeing some of that, obviously, but I think just as many people are moving from the cores of cities like a San Francisco to great streetcar neighborhoods or small towns, right? That neighborhood scale, that 2 and 3 stories, because you get a little bit more elbow room, but it can deliver the benefits and amenities of the walkable urbanism
Right.
that people want, and even more so the younger generations are really looking for
Right.
and demanding.
Well, and it's interesting. We talk all the time, locally about what's going on with development issues, and some of those macro trends and micro trends. But I think you make an important point there, and it's also the context is so interesting today because 30 or 40 years ago, if you wanted to move, if for some reason you felt like you were paying too much money in an urban location, or maybe the schools didn't work for you, maybe you were worried about crime, who knows what, and you wanted to move to a suburban location or an ex-urban location, most of those places didn't really offer any of the walkable amenities of your urban area. But now, with what's happened over the last couple of decades, and so many suburban communities have jumped on the bandwagon of trying to have at least some modest level of walkability here and there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole different context now, and people can find more of that than they would have ever before. And it's an interesting competitive landscape for cities.
Yeah, and I actually feel like my sense is what's has been happening is the Kansas Cities and the Des Moines have been sort of sneaking up on people and like just very quietly becoming better and better places that people are discovering.
Yeah.
But I think the next iteration and sort of the mid to longer term is, I think, and I see this, you see this happening too, but I think the small towns are going to see a resurrection and revitalization because, somebody might have grown up in a small Midwestern town or South or Southeast and moved away to a big city and, you know, developed a skill set, and they're like, well, why wouldn't I move back to my hometown and buy a Main Street building and incubate my business in it, right? And do something really creative. And I think that's really the future of where urbanism's going. It's the small town, especially with remote work. Obviously, is a big piece of
Right.
More people don't need to be in the office, and so I'm pretty excited about that. Actually, like I think a lot of these towns, these smaller towns that have struggled for a really long time, are going to see some reinvestment and some energy sort of re-injected back into them. And I would imagine that I also see like younger people taking positions as elected officials, right,
Mm-hmm.
which is making a difference, sort of demanding that the cities prepare themselves, even the smaller ones,
Right.
for removing all those barriers that we've been trying to get cities to remove in their zoning and planning and just policy. So it's exciting to see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a huge trend we're not talking very much about, and the impact on small towns all over the country. It used to be that we would talk about maybe small towns that were within like a very short commute shed of a major city, and
Yeah.
there are hundreds of those around the country that have really thrived in the last few decades. But I can absolutely see that extending further over the next decade or two. I had the opportunity to speak last year at the Missouri Main Streets Conference, which was just, it's one of those, like, it's a group of like Main Street organizations and downtown organizations,
Yeah.
mostly for, small towns in Missouri. And that was kind of the message that I sent to them. And I felt like, this is your window of opportunity. And there's a lot of macro stuff that's changing right now. There are probably more people thinking about small towns now than they ever were 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And this is the window of time to think about how do you capitalize on that? How do you take advantage of it and provide, there's a certain sort of small town lifestyle that people idealize that they may be looking for, but how do you do that and actually have that idyllic small town character
Yeah.
that people really want?
Well, and there's a tremendous amount of diversity in a lot of those small towns now, right? From people from all over the world are moving to those small
Yeah.
towns, and they may actually be minority white at this
Hmm.
point, a lot of them. And what like the town my dad grew up in, Schuyler, Nebraska, which has a big meat packing plant as
Hmm.
kind of one of the big economic generators, large Latino population over the last 25 years. And that Main Street was very vibrant when I was growing up too. I was on my grandfather's farm, and we'd like on a Saturday at the end of the day go downtown and see a movie or get an ice cream cone. and then it went into a state of disrepair, sort of late 90s, early aughts. And but the Latino population now has opened up businesses, like some of the best food you can get. Like
Hmm.
I'm just amazed by it. So there's also that aspect of like the culture that exists in these small towns. That's super interesting, that you kind of envision as a big city
Hmm.
thing historically, right? But it's now exists in all these small towns, which is super interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a kind of a similar phenomenon here. Even obviously, you see it within big metro areas too. But I think about Kansas City, Kansas, which is often the like forgotten stepsister in the metro area here. Um, as some of the original like European immigrant descendants started moving out over the last 40 or 50 years, a lot of the inner neighborhoods really fell into disrepair, and the commercial streets did too. And in the last 2 decades, they've all been repopulated by largely by Mexican and Central American
Yeah.
immigrants. And it's remarkable what's happening there now. And you're right. I mean, the food's incredible. The culture is lively. People are excited. They're renovating properties. They're buying properties. And it's made a huge difference in that community, a huge positive difference.
And this, they didn't have any money, so they didn't tear anything down.
Right, right,
Like so everything's still pretty intact, which is awesome.
yeah.
And it's interesting, like the mentality in those little towns historically was such that they put no value in the upper floors of those Main Street buildings. I remember my parents still live back in the small town I grew up in, and occasionally I'll like go look at a building that's for sale in downtown as my hobby when I'm there visiting. And I remember a few years ago looking at a little 2-story, 50-foot wide building, and the realtor showed me the ground floor. He's like, well, would you like to see anything else? I'm like, well, are you going to show me the upper floor? And he's like, oh, this building doesn't have an upper floor. The realtor didn't even know that there was a second floor in this building because it hadn't been used for 3 or 4 decades or
Yeah.
more. And he was shocked that I'm like, I'm an architect. I'm pretty sure there's another floor up
Yeah,
there
I see
because
two stories in this building.
there's a whole row of windows. And like he eventually found his keys to get us up to the second floor. But like that mentality of a lot of those towns was there's only value in the ground floor. You're starting to see some investment in those upper floors. Um, in my hometown, it's actually, I've seen some Airbnbs actually, mostly. So it's interesting to see that, and it's part of that transition of and also seeing those downtowns as a neighborhood and not a central business district, right? That was I still can envision that sign on the highway in Columbus, Nebraska that says that direction to the central business
Hmm.
district. It's like, who wants to go to the central business district? Like, I want to go to downtown, right?
Yeah,
And so it's like part of this shift in mentality is, hey, your downtown should be seen as a neighborhood, not as the central business district, because historically people lived there. Sure, people worked there. There were businesses there, but it should be a neighborhood just as much as it is a destination for
yeah.
commercial services and amenities.
It was such a 20th century kind of approach to thinking about cities
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they're all fragmented into these different districts, and that's the business district. So
Well, and so the duplex my great grandmother lived in, which I said it's a block and a half from Main Street. When she passed away, the house got sold, and it got scraped, and the new owner built what the zoning asked for, which was a single story suburban office building with a big parking lot around it.
mm,
And it's like, this is a place that also right now is having an affordable housing discussion. And like, hey, you tore down
mm-hmm,
most of your missing middle because that's what your zoning asked for
yeah.
and requires. And those smaller places in particular, right, don't have the resources to make some of those changes usually. So
Well, I think that's a good segue to dive into the missing middle a little bit more. It's one of the
mhm.
one of the conversations that we've had a lot over the years has been thinking about who are the actual people that are going to live in missing middle housing. Who are the people who are going to buy it? Who's going to make it happen? And I know there's no one answer to all that, but you've done as much work as anybody in that area, and I'm curious. You've had this really wild, diverse, set of clients that have tried to do it. Everything from like the mom and pops to clients like our mutual friend in Omaha,
Yeah.
who is basically building an entire missing middle community himself. But I'm just curious. I mean, you've probably had a chance to think about this a lot. Who do you think are the people who actually build or own or make this happen for missing middle housing?
Yeah, it's what we've discovered to date is it hasn't been the bigger production builders. They're just too slow to change, and we've tried to work with them, but they just won't. They're not willing to innovative enough for us to spend time
Mm-hmm.
working with them. That being said, a lot of our clients are building at scale. Um, the the Jerry Reimer building, the missing middle neighborhood in Papillion, Nebraska, the Omaha Metro, that'll be 600 missing middle units when done. It's about 300 units completed to date, and it's outperforming every other multifamily project in the Omaha Metro right now. And there's the cul-de-sacs, right?
Mm-hmm.
The car-free community we designed in Tempe that's now, I think it's about 150 units mostly completed.
Mm-hmm.
And the first round of residents will move in next month,
Oh, great.
in May. And it's kind of, it's what we've found is that it's the people who are taking informed risk. Like they're not just going, oh, we want missing middle. They're doing their own thoughtful analysis of the market, but not in a conventional way. Like none of our projects rely on a conventional market study. Like, and that's what we kind of tell people first. If you're going to rely on a conventional market study, like it's not going to tell you that you need this because nobody's done it. But so our clients like always are really thoughtful and understand their market and understand sort of that target market and who we need to design for. But that being said, is there is so much need and so much demand for missing middle that I feel like you could build 20 different types of missing middle projects on most of these locations and these sites, and they would all succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They'd all be successful. It could be for sale, it could be for rent, it could be a mix, it could be stacked units, it could be not stacked unit, fee simple units. And when I wrote the first article about missing middle housing in 2011 for the Smart Growth Network in this publication, we initially framed this as meeting the demand, right? Because there was a proven growing demand for walkable urbanism, but that can translate directly into a demand for non-single family housing types or small lot single family. And but as over the last 5 to 7 years, it's become clear that in addition to meeting the demand for this, there's a need for this as part of the attainable housing delivery, right? It's because you can no longer, in many markets, you can no longer build a single family detached house and sell it at a price point that an entry level buyer can afford.
Right.
Almost no market. So so all of a sudden you need to be thinking about missing middle types, duplex, fourplex, cottage courts. And unfortunately there's still this day and age tremendous zoning barriers as a start. There's a lot of barriers, but zoning as a starting point, that it's kind of when we wrote our form-based code book now 16 years ago, I think it's been, like, I'd hoped by this point in time that there'd be so many seasoned practitioners delivering really great zoning reform work that I'd never have to do it again. That I could just do the really fun stuff and the architecture and the planning. But unfortunately, the reality of the situation is there's still only a small handful of practitioners who really understand, especially this typology, this range of typologies, and how do you enable it in a zoning code? it's kind of an art in some ways that unfortunately not enough people know about, and very few people are being trained in.
Yeah.
Right. That's it. All comes back to, and I think this is one of the bullet points of when we were sort of going back and forth of what we should discuss is like ultimately like academia needs to change in architecture and planning schools and engineering schools, right? To get us on the right route to enabling and legalizing walkable urbanism countrywide.
Yeah. I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
First, I have a little bit more about on the missing middle because
Yeah, that's great.
um, so it's interesting to me, when I think about like the was it Prairie Crossing, the project, the Jerry's project in Papillion.
Prairie, well, it's Prairie Queen is what
Prairie
we
Queen.
call it. It's
Yeah.
called Bungalows on the Lake by the marketing team, and
Okay.
I can't say that name.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just like so it's yeah, Prairie Queen.
So
There's a
Prairie Queen and cul-de-sac are really interesting, well done communities, but essentially like single developer projects, substantial,
yeah
pretty large projects. So missing middle in terms of the building types, but it's sort of a large increment. And I know that Jerry Reimer, who built Prairie Queen, he started out just buying like individual
yeah
buildings in Omaha, and then building up his portfolio that way. So I, I, I'm still curious about, how we think about greater adoption of missing middle types and people actually buying them. And I'm just like to have you react to this thought that I've had.
mm-hmm.
It's something that I have talked to a lot of planners about locally. Is that the reason, one of the reasons, in my opinion, that we see so many house flippers in a given market is because flipping a house basically has no barriers to it. There's a lot of supply of single family houses, and there's almost no regulatory barriers to doing it. It's, in many cases, you don't even need a permit at all.
Yep.
And I have challenged them to say, if we want more missing middle, we need to make it as easy as flipping a house, because it's probably a lot of the same types of investors, sort of mom and pop people, either doing it on the side or maybe they're making a career out of it. Maybe it's like a Jerry Reimer who starts that way and builds himself up, but it's a different class of investors than like a large developer.
Yeah, it's Karen often says that she thinks there should be a reality or a home improvement show called Flip the Fourplex, right?
Yes,
It's like,
yes.
right? Like there should be somebody doing that. So it's super interesting when sort of historically in our practice, and even when we initially sort of formally sort of branded the missing middle housing concept, is we were initially thinking about that incremental sort of one lot at a time scale, and I think that's really important, and that's actually what's happening mostly, like the small local builder or the realtor who is becoming a developer, or the architect who's becoming a developer, or the civil engineer. Actually, we see a lot of civil engineers sort of transitioning into developers. Like there's a lot of that happening, but you don't hear about it because the impact is pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to continue to foster and to make it as easy for a fourplex as it is for a single family home, for sure. We kind of realized that we could have a bigger impact with our developer clients if we sort of demonstrated this at scale. And it's not that we think everybody needs to be doing this at scale. I think it needs to be a combination of, hey, that one lot at a time, or that small builder buying 4 lots on a block and sort of building one at a time. But I think when we actually struggled to commit to doing the Prairie Queen project because it was an isolated greenfield site with no transit, and we had actually, as a business, committed to not doing greenfield projects for almost 10 years. But what we realized is it was a big enough site to demonstrate, and it was going to be all missing middle, so it could demonstrate how a missing middle business model could compete and outcompete a conventional garden apartment development model, and that's what it's proving. And I think that's really important,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why, like, we can go into the ULI
Mm-hmm.
conference and talk about this, and people are like, wow, like this is viable at scale. And that project in particular has been so successful is that we're actually about to launch an online sales portal for the plans of that particular project, and we're calling it the Missing Middle Neighborhood Kit.
Hmm.
And because we realize that we need to maximize our impact and sort of just help take this to scale where we can sell those plans, and make them available through construction documents for a licensing fee. And that it's not it's not a new model, right? There's a lot of house plan
Mm-hmm.
businesses, but what I've realized is, like, most of them stop at duplex
Yep.
because of building code, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Or licensing. And then some of them go up to like fourplex, but I, there's hardly any, if any at all, that like go up to eightplex or tenplex. And so we've been vetting this for the last year and a half, and actually in the next couple of months we're gonna launch this online sales portal. So that's super exciting.
So that leads me to ask you to think about, especially those couple of projects. I know you've worked on others that had some scale to it, but
Yeah.
what are there some lessons learned from the architecture side, from the design side, that you would carry forward from especially those, or working at trying to create more of a repetitive model like that
Yeah,
for missing middle?
absolutely. And like even the Daybreak Muse homes,
Mm-hmm.
which have won a handful of awards, and it's still one of my favorite projects. And that type was originally designed for sale within the larger master plan community of Daybreak, and our client was able to sell it for about 30 grand less than their tuck under townhouse. So it to us, it's like, so right, my architecture career started working at these super high end architecture firms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like we were doing things like, I worked on a federal courthouse, baseball stadium, but then I was like designing John Bon Jovi's house, Michael Eisner's house. Like there's like no budget, and so like we're doing good design, but to me it wasn't. It wasn't. I wasn't excited about it. It wasn't having an impact. So, but I learned good design. So part of in early on in Opticos, right, even in the early 2000s, we like had a satellite office in Seaside, Florida, and we designed some really beautiful vacation houses. But once again, like that's not our model now. And what we've done over the last 10 years in particular is say, hey, we're going to demonstrate that we can deliver good design at attainable price points. And we're going to deliver good design through more of a production model of delivery, right? Because Daybreak was built, sorry, the Muse homes were built by one of the largest builders in the Salt Lake City region. And prior to that, we had never worked with a production builder, right? It's like, but we were like, hey, here's an opportunity to make a difference and to do this at scale. And so, I mean, Kevin, you know this, and we were talking about this 25 years ago when we were working on some of these projects, is like, how do you dial up or down the architecture, or where do you spend the money? Like the Muse homes are like the most simple boxes and simple roof forms, and that's where our client gets efficiency. And it's just the proportions are good, the window proportions are good. Hey, guess what? It has vinyl windows, which like 15 years ago I was allergic to. If you can work around those things and put details in just the right places, and so and the site planning becomes more important, right?
Right.
Because you're part of the value you're creating is the placemaking, and you're differentiating through placemaking. You're differentiating through typology, right? Because all of our projects over the last 10 years, as our clients deliver them, and they're unlike anything else on the market, and so they don't have any competition.
Yeah.
And even in the Prairie Queen project, like it started with thoughtfulness in unit plans that were based on a module that we could swap unit plans in and out of the same building footprint as the project gets built. Um, a mix of massing and typology that had sort of, wider frontage, narrower frontage, gables versus hips. But those were executed at a really, Jerry ran those at $1.20 a square foot rents in his
Wow.
pro forma, which is
Wow.
really low compared to any other market we've worked in. And so we had to be really thoughtful about how do we get good architecture, but not break the bank, right?
Hmm.
In that sort of a spectrum. And so, you know, some people might look at the architecture and go like, oh man, like they blew that detail or this detail. But like the neighborhood feels great. Like
Hmm.
people love it. The last time I was out there, which was about a year ago, like people had occupied the porches and personalized the porches, like, banners and seating and, all the little tchotchkes that people put on
Hmm.
their porches. Uh, and, and so, it's like, how do you deliver good design at attainable price points is a really good challenge for all of us. And I think, yeah, it's kind of been a transition in our practice to challenge ourselves to
Hmm.
deliver good design at attainable price points.
Yeah, I
So
think
but it's really important.
it would be fascinating probably to do a walkthrough on that project with you and Jerry, and just talk about all the different ways that you look to achieve efficiencies from the design standpoint, so that he could keep the costs in line, but you still obviously were delivering the neighborhood amenity, which is really
Yeah,
the major thing that you were hoping would sell.
yeah, and variety, right?
Yeah,
Variety in form and scale and materials.
right.
But it's all built out of hardy.
Hmm.
Various applications of hardy panels, hardy horizontal siding, but it feels great and it's performing super well. And in cul-de-sac, because the urban pattern and the typology is so driven by the extreme desert climate, it's kind of its own little design exercise for sure. Like we wouldn't do that in very many other places in the US, but we challenged ourselves to see how simple the architecture could be, because the buildings are 8 feet apart. There's
Hmm.
a public paseo that's 8 feet wide. So the buildings just need to be fabric buildings. They need to activate and define the public spaces. But if you look at that architecture, it's super super simple, and obviously there's precedent for that. Whether it be the Barrio Viejo in Tucson, or Egyptian urbanism,
Hmm.
and architecture historically. And so it feels really good, and I think it'll only get better as the landscape gets put in. But the spaces feel really good right now,
Hmm.
and even under construction. So it's exciting.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and make sure we have links to all those projects in the show notes, in case people haven't seen them. Everything from
Yeah,
Daybreak to Prairie Queen to Cul-de-sac and others. So they're all really different and interesting efforts. And I think I would also, for anybody listening who isn't really familiar with the work of people in the Urban Guild or the Congress for the New Urbanism, I would put a shameless plug in now, because I have felt like throughout my career, there's so much that you touched on that it's like it it resonates with me, because so much within our profession, within the architecture profession, there's always been this. I don't know a better way to say it other than sort of a snobbish, look down on like suburban development, and
mm-hmm.
not getting involved with builders and developers as like a way to maintain like your status as well. I just don't get involved, in all that. And I think what you've done and what other people in the CNU have done over the years to say, well, we think this is a problem. We're actually going to get involved. We're going to try to work with builders. We're going to work with developers to try to solve these problems and understand their language,
Yep.
and try to build places that have the walkable character to it. And I so admire that in people who do it. And I think it's great that you all have done some of that on your projects.
Yeah, and it's like from a business model perspective, like we could be making a lot more money doing working for one type of client on one type of project.
Hmm.
So we kind of make it hard for ourselves, and we don't have a typical client,
Yeah.
right? It's like who wants to innovate, who's knocking at our door, and so it keeps it exciting. And I think that you know, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts, interviews with Rick Rubin the last
Hmm.
couple of weeks because he just released this book called The Creative Act, and
Hmm.
I've been fascinated by his whole approach and his story. And I think part of this is he talked about the reason he was able to do what he did with the music industry and introducing hip hop to the masses was he didn't know any better.
Yeah.
Like he didn't have to unlearn the way of producing a record or creating a recording business. And I feel like because I was fortunate enough to be trained in all of this in the right way of good urbanism, like I didn't have to unlearn like the wrong way of doing things like a lot of people have to, and he said something really super interesting, which was like you shouldn't play the cards that people think you're going to play or should play. You should play the cards that you want to play.
Hmm.
And I kind of feel like, from the very start of our practice and even the work we did with you and others early on is like we were like challenging the status quo, right?
Hmm.
And just doing things different. And that was necessary and continues to still be necessary of like we're not afraid to try to do something differently because it's going to take to address our attainable housing issues, to meet the demand for walkable urbanism, to get our cities, our small towns prepared to accommodate, right, the people that want to be living there. So it's super super interesting, super inspiring.
Yeah. I, I I feel like I could go into a whole other topic here with you related to form-based codes, but
Yep.
I know we're going to come up on our time here pretty quickly. But I do want to
Yep.
ask you if we just go back to the earlier discussion about like Isla Vista when we worked there when you did that project,
Yep.
which I remember as a really fun charrette, and
Yeah.
I think one of the more enjoyable parts that I'll confess to is how we got that really awful architect fired who was working for the university, producing some god awful housing. But think back to that and the work that you did, and you said a lot has evolved and changed with that. How what has the impact of that been, and what have you seen happen as a result of working in a code in that situation? Uh, were there specific lessons just from that effort that you carry forward today in your form-based code work?
Yeah, I think part of it was that I think a lot of cities and a lot of planners get caught up in the graphics, and they just slap graphics on top of an otherwise conventional code that really didn't think it wasn't thoughtful about what the metrics actually needed to be to deliver urbanism. And it might look like a code that you wrote or code that we wrote or one of our colleagues wrote, but it doesn't actually have the DNA to deliver urbanism. And actually what happened with our Isla Vista code is because it was so new and foreign is the planning staff took all the graphics out of it and just made it a word-based,
Hmm.
text-based code. And like we were pretty disappointed at the time, but it delivered the right metrics. And there's actually been quite a bit of new development over the last 20 years under that code. So, I think it's our our coding practice. We've really decided to focus at the county and the regional scale in our more recent work, and the seeds of this were really planted 10 plus years ago when we were working on a shared code for Beaufort County, South Carolina, that the county and several other smaller unincorporated jurisdictions ended up using. And then our work in Cincinnati, which was a citywide form-based code that was applied to pre-identified sort of walkable urban place types. And most recently, we rewrote we call it a zoning toolkit. Seems to resonate with people for Marin County, which won the Driehaus Form-Based Code Award this year. It was written to be used by the county and 11 different jurisdictions within the county, and almost nobody thought this was going to be successful. Even the planning directors who met every other week were very skeptical at the beginning, and it's now adopted by the county and adopted by, I think, 2 or 3 other jurisdictions, and 5 others are in the process of implementing it. And what resonated with the planners, the decision makers in the community, is when we showed them our analysis of the urban form and the places that exist, and sort of basically talked about how San Anselmo may be different from Mill Valley in some ways, but there's shared characteristics that we could code as well. And so now we're taking that same approach. We're hired by ABAG, who's the regional planning organization here in the Bay Area, to apply the same approach to the entire Bay Area. So we're in the middle of drafting that, sort of a place-based zoning toolkit. And then we're also doing that in the Puget Sound region, specifically for missing middle scale residential. And so our coding practice has always evolved as we work on different projects. And just before coming on onto this podcast today, I was like looking over the shoulder of one of my teammates going like, what is that? Like, I haven't even seen that yet. And they're like, oh, this is the Puget Sound place types documentation. I'm like, oh, that looks fantastic. And it had evolved since the last time I saw it applied, which is great to see. So I have a really talented team. So I'm excited about that. But it's what's really strange still is like the form-based code is a term that some planners it gets them up in arms. Like, you just use the word, and like we're like, so we sometimes have to be like, okay, like, we don't care what you call it. Don't call it anything, just call it this is the best zoning to deliver what you want in your community. And so we've had to step away a little bit actually from calling it form-based coding in a lot of places, and like, that's fine. Like, we don't care what you call it, but the methodology is still the same, right? And we actually we had a phone call the other day with a group of planning directors. I'm not going to say for which project, and one of the directors was like, this will never work. This is for greenfield sites, flat lots, regular shapes and sizes of lots. And, what was great is one of the other planning directors said, you know what, I looked at what the Opticos team did in Marin County, and we're actually already applying what they did in Marin County. So we think this is a great approach. So like, we're not having to make the argument in a lot of those instances is other people stepping in and saying like, okay, you don't like this. Well, you don't actually have to use this. This is a toolkit that only those who choose to use it can use it. So anyway, that was a long answer.
No, that's fine. That's good. I mean, there's so much to talk about here. I think, I think at some point we'll have to do this again. And we could probably spend a whole hour just talking about form-based codes and
it's obviously, it's really important. And there's been some progress. There's been some progress in sort of support for the concept, but there's still a lot of pushback.
Yeah, and we've had this long-running discussion about scaling it. How does it scale and everything else. So I think we could probably dive deep on that.
Well, and that's why we decided to focus on these regional toolkits, because like, we're a pretty small practice still. We're like 25 plus or minus a couple people, but like, if we can do a zoning toolkit for a region that 15, 20 in the Bay Area, it could be like 70 or 80 jurisdictions could use, like, that's a way better use of our limited capacity than to like get caught up in Austin, Texas code rewrite for 6 years, and then it gets caught up in a lawsuit, and 8 years later, it's still not adopted, so it's like, that's where we can maximize our impact. And that's also why we decided to do the licensing of the prototypes, to really just let our impact spread beyond what a 25 person firm can do sort of on a one project basis at a time.
Yeah. yeah. It also makes me think about the trajectory of how accessory dwelling units has gone from a crazy radical thing to now becoming sort of the hip thing that most cities really want to take on. But my goodness, it's been 25 years. We've been
Yeah.
toiling
It,
to just try to get people to accept the notion that those should be by right for most
yeah.
houses.
And it's I tell cities, um, you should support ADUs, but don't get caught up in just an ADU discussion, because if
Right.
you're gonna fall behind if you haven't already, right? It's
Yeah.
like that should be a no brainer. Like
Yeah.
jump to fourplex, right? Like cottage court, and ADUs. But I know we're running out of time, but a super interesting project we're working on for a developer is an infill site in Seattle. And Seattle just created a new small lot residential zoning district. And then citywide, they're allowing ADUs to be sold separate from the primary units.
Hmm.
And so what was really cool is through this project is, for example, you can do attached ADUs, you can do stacked ADUs, you can do detached ADUs, but they have a cap of 1,000 square feet. So what their system is doing is it's creating incentive for a developer to build a small for sale unit in that ADU that gets sold separate from the primary unit. So it's delivering attainability in a really super creative way. So to me, that's the next
Yeah.
iteration of where ADUs need to go, is just like incentivizing the sale of the smaller unit.
Yeah. 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 I'll have to take a look at that as well. It's interesting. Well, let's stop there, Dan, and
Okay.
and and wrap this up. I do like to ask my guests at the end of the podcast. This is the Messy City podcast, so I like to ask if
Yes.
there's like a favorite place, a city, a neighborhood that comes to mind when you hear that term and think about something that probably has a lot of those missing middle characteristics to it, and probably developed more organically. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think any good city's a messy city. Any good neighborhood's a little bit messy. When you start to clean it up too much, it becomes sterile, right, in a subdivision. So, I mean, the first place that came to mind for me was the Shoreditch neighborhood in East London, and I had the pleasure to discover it about 15 years ago when we were first doing work with the Prince's Foundation, and their offices are based there. And it was just this, uh, had historically kind of been disinvested in, but as with many places, what brought it back was just this really creative artist community and culture. And still today has some of the most amazing street art of any place in the country.
Hmm.
And just the most unique, unexpected experiences as you're wandering through these places. I call it like we often talk about a series of theatrical events like that. You just like you turn a corner and something unexpected. It's a public space, or it's a big mural, or it's like a street market or a food vendor is happening. And that neighborhood was the first one that came to mind when you sort of asked me about the messy city. And it's just like every other place over the course of the last 15 years, it's a little bit less messy than it was 15 years ago, for
Yeah.
better or worse. But I think that's there's just an energy in those types of places, and a vibrancy that the messiness is a part of and reinforces.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, Dan, thanks so much for doing this. I'll look forward to getting you on here again in the future, maybe some point later this year. Are you going to be attending the Congress for New Urbanism this year?
Unfortunately, I will not be there this year.
Okay.
There will be others from Opticos that are going to go, but I have this Missing Middle Road tour this year that has a lot of speaking events, and
Good.
it sort of got some things scheduled at the same time as CNU is happening. So unfortunately, I won't be able to make it.
All right. Well, we'll do a future one, but
Yep.
I'll love to have you back on. Thanks again, and take care.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.